Adrian Currie is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Philosophy and Anthropology at the University of Exeter. And he's a philosopher of science whose work focuses on scientific method, especially in the historical sciences, like paleontology and archaeology. And he's also written on the comparative method in biology. And today he's giving a talk called Morgan's Canon and the Shape of Intelligence.
Cool, thanks. This has been really fun. I've not gone to sort of a bunch of talks on the sort of topic for ages, and I've not thought about it very much for ages. So it's really fun to get to do this. So lots of folks have started thinking about the sort of shape or space of intelligence or possible intelligences. And when I think about intelligence, I think about it primarily as a kind of biological trait. And so I find myself wanting to think about intelligence in terms of what's sometimes called the sort of comparative method. I'm going to do three things. First thing I'm going to do is not talk about intelligence at all and talk to you about all right, I'm going to start by thinking about just comparative thinking generally, give you a sort of sketch of that. I'm then going to give a totally wild interpretation of Morgan's Canon, and I'm then going to use that to think about the shape of intelligence. So going super quickly, here is a cat skull. Notice that the cat skull has a gap between the molars and the incisors. Here's another cat skull. This is a Smilodon. So the first one's a house cat, second one's Smilodon. Notice again, big gap between the incisors, big tooth, and the molars. That's a diagnostic trait for big cats and small cats. Here's a wolf, here's a badger. They don't have the gaps, right? So across carnivora, you've got wolves and badgers that don't have the gaps, but all the cats have those gaps. Why do they have the gaps? Well, because the way that cats kill things is primarily via strangulation. They've got a kind of clamp grip, and that little gap gives them some space to get the neck in there. Notice that in this discussion, we've already talked about adaptation. We've talked about features of morphology and functional morphology, and we put things in a phylogenetic context. We can go further, though. Oh, yeah, so here's a tiger. You can tell it's a cat because it's got that gap between the incisors and the molars. Glorious. Right. With this information, we can start doing a whole bunch of fun stuff. So here we have some principal component analysis. Don't worry about what that is. Effectively, it's a space of skull shapes. And on this sort of space, we have the images, the pictures are of placental mammals, the letters are of marsupial mammals. So we can identify within the space of skull shapes, for instance, dog space, right, where all the dogs are. Notice there's a whole bunch of letters there. This indicates that a bunch of marsupials have converged, have independently evolved on dog-like skulls. Here's cat space. Cat space doesn't have any letters in it. It seems as if no marsupial has evolved a cat-like skull. This raises a bunch of other questions. Why don't marsupials occupy that space? One hypothesis is that it's to do with how their teeth develop. Another hypothesis is to do with the way that they are born. And so what we do is we situate this information about morphology, adaptation, and phylogenetics within a kind of space and use that to both provide explanations and further questions. This is what I think of as an evolutionary profile. An evolutionary profile is effectively a way of situating biological information for the purposes of making comparisons and contrasts. And biologists use a huge number of these. So here's one I've been thinking about recently. What we're interested in here is secondarily aquatic vertebrates. In other words, animals who have returned to the water. Turns out there are 4 different ways that they swim, and we can sort of categorize it in these different ways based on both sort of functional things. So you've got the appendicular versus axial. So that's whether or not you go back and forth like a shark, or up and down like a dolphin, for instance. And we can start plotting these different animals out. Again, notice that this way of representing the information is neither primarily functional, nor primarily phylogenetic, nor primarily ecological. Rather, it's a way of integrating all of this information together. And so comparative thinking, I've just tried to sort of illustrate this. What you do is you conceive of biological lineages as these things which are shaped by multiple forces: development, ancestry, adaptation, local ecological environment, and so forth. And this way of thinking is a fundamentally integrative one. You don't split apart your thinking about adaptation from your thinking about development or whatever. You rather bring them together, right? And you do this using these kind of evolutionary profiles. And these profiles, I think, are fundamentally research guiding. What makes data significant, why people do the experiments they do, so on and so forth, makes sense in terms of how it fits within that comparative framework. And this means that categorization is much more flexible than people often think, right? We've got very, very local categorization. So you can think about that space of secondary aquatic vertebrate swimming. In that case, we're categorizing, say, beavers as a particular, in a very peculiar way, right? It's very local, and it's often very paraphyletic. So that's sort of comparative thinking. In that book I briefly mentioned before everything went to hell, I sort of try and apply this to comparative psychology in a way I don't think I did as well as I could have. But I'm going to very briefly sketch the sort of argument I give there. And for those who know about Morgan's canon, I suggest you go and talk to Cozzy, who gave a much richer discussion of this yesterday. I'm going to be embarrassingly casual about it. In fact, I'm going to be so embarrassingly casual that I'm going to use Clever Hans as the example. I can cash it out with like proper examples downstream if you wish. So here's our man Morgan back in 1894. He's giving a sort of principle that we should use about what sorts of psychical faculties, cognitive things we should posit when we're giving explanations. In no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. So, as probably we all know, Clever Hans is a horse. The horse seems to be able to clop his little hooves the correct number of times when he is faced with math puzzles. This is remarkable because it suggests that a horse can do maths. It's then discovered that, however, it looks like another hypothesis is the horse is basically picking up on bodily cues, picking up on human body language and using that to tell when to stop the clopping. Our sort of intuitive idea is, hey, it looks like doing maths is somehow higher on the psychological scale than reading body language. Now, a lot of the philosophers who have thought about Morgan's canon, we often don't like it, have thought about higher and lower in terms of maybe functional capacities or complexity, or maybe in terms of parsimony in various ways. I think all of that doesn't work, and I'm happy to talk about why it doesn't work. And I think that's not really what Morgan had in mind either. About 10 years later than the quote that everyone quotes, there's a very similar version of Morgan's canon with a crucial difference. In this case, he talks about things which stand lower in the scale of psychological evolution and development. Now, what Morgan meant by evolution and development is something which is in some ways very different to the way we would think about it now, but nonetheless, I think what he's getting at here is not some kind of idea of functional complexity or anything like that. He's rather saying, situate the thing you're trying to understand in terms of its evolutionary and developmental context. In other words, do some comparative thinking. So in that book, I have a bash at kind of accounting for or giving a version of what Morgan's canon might look like if we turned it into one that was about comparative thinking. Now, I'm not the first person to do this, of course. People like Elliot Sober have done work on this as well. But here's my basic idea. We should prefer these explanations when, first off, they're appealing to capacities we know are already in the critter, namely either by knowing already or by homologous inference. Or we can appeal to things which are highly evolvable. So there might be ones which are co-optable from capacities they already have, or ones for which there is high selection pressure. So why, in the case of Clever Hans, is it better to think of better to think of reading body language than it is to think of doing maths? Well, because we already know that as herd mammals, horses are very attuned to various types of horse body language. It seems as if shifting from understanding a horse to understanding other species seems fairly co-optable. Indeed, lots of herd animals read the body language of different species of herd animal. And indeed, there being, a couple of thousand years at least of co-evolution between ourselves and horses, there is high selection pressure for them to do it. And so I think this makes sense of the intuition that we should prefer the body language one much better than the other sorts of interpretations we might have of Morgan's canon. And so we can, instead of understanding Morgan's canon in terms of simplicity or different functional complexity and so forth, we can think of it as an instance of comparative thinking. What it says is, hey, prefer explanations about cognition which are situated within an evolutionary profile. Whew, okay, let's think about the shape of intelligence. Sorry, this is a real wild ride, this talk. So when people think about the shape of intelligence, they think about it in lots of different ways. What I'm interested in doing is bringing this idea of an evolutionary profile to play. But first, I want to think about the resources we often have and use when we're building up a picture of the shape of intelligence. So one sort of resource, one source of data, which I think Amelia gave a really beautiful example of, is something which I'm going to very meanly call methodological anthropocentrism. What you do is you adapt various experimental paradigms and questions from developmental psychology and psychology and sort of adapt them to the way that to animals. So we might be interested, for instance, in whether chimpanzees can pass the false belief test. On the other end of the scale, what some folks do is adopt very minimal notions of cognition. So you might think of cognition as just information flow, maybe behavioral flexibility, adaptivity, these sorts of things. So people doing plant cognition like doing this. What you then do is do experiments on your plant, for instance, as a way of seeing how flexible that cognition is, what sorts of information flow you can detect, and so on and so forth. Another sort of thing we use is sort of cognitive or neural modeling. So we can sort of give a sort of minimal characterization in a computational system. So Andrew Barron's keynote yesterday, he gave some beautiful examples of how to do that with bee cognition. And I suppose we can also poke brains, but I don't ever really know what people are talking about when they're poking brains, so I'm not going to really expand upon this. So we've got all of these different pieces of data and pieces of information. There's a question, how do we interpret this and how does this come together in an evolutionary profile or in a shape of intelligence? Well, a distinction I draw in the book, which I think is something that people need to pay a lot more attention to, is the difference between how something like Morgan's Canon plays out in experimental design and how it plays out in what I'm going to call kind of hypothesis acceptance. I think there's a big difference between showing that an animal, for instance, can perform something under experimental conditions and whether or not that lineage has a particular capacity, like domain general intelligence or something like that, simply because I don't think that's how experiments and so forth work. Experiments can be made sense of in terms of the broader context in which they are performed and the kind of data in which they are put together with. I'm not going to have time, I'm just going to skip that so we have time. If you want to, I can go and talk about some Neanderthal counting, which was going to be sort of an example of this, but I'll leave it. And so the sort of idea here is that in comparative context, at least, when we're doing comparative thinking, the way that we make sense of these results is not by saying, does this experiment establish this cognitive capacity? Rather, what we do is we put it into an evolutionary profile and we're able to make sense of it in light of that. And so it's in bringing together data from all of those different sources that we're able to start making inferences about what sort of cognitive capacities these critters have. And at least in biological context, those inferences, I think, are fundamentally shaped by evolutionary profiles. Okay, so Andrew Barron again talked about one way of having what I think of as an evolutionary profile, which is a evolutionary transitions or major transitions kind of model. So Ginsberg and Jablonka have one, and Barron, Helena, and Klein are developing one at the moment. The idea of a sort of evolutionary transitions framework is to say that the evolution of some trait here, intelligence, is governed by path-dependent events involving major changes to perhaps the capacity and the evolvability of here cognitive structures and behaviors. So this is giving a sort of narrative in your evolutionary profile. And I want to just note that also not only is it giving a narrative, it also involves adopting a very minimal notion of cognition. So Ginsberg and Jablonka basically say, hey, you know, anything that if you're learning, then you're a cognitive system. And by learning, I just mean experience-dependent behavioral response. So if you got that, then you're a cognitive system. And so this really depends upon adopting a very minimal notion of cognition, which makes sense if you're interested in exploring the shape of intelligence. But it's worth noting that these sorts of evolutionary profiles, these ways of contextualizing that data, are quite different to the ways I was illustrating in the first part of the talk. Here, we don't have a narrative per se. What we're rather doing is situating these organisms within their sort of phylogenetic context without a sort of necessary trajectory. We may draw narratives in and without these kinds of things, but they're a very different way of, I think, representing an evolutionary profile. And I think another example are, morphospaces. Morphospaces are different again. So here's the classic example from David Raup. So we have a theoretical morphospace, which is just a priori geometry, effectively. I'm able to grow using 3 dimensions, a shape of a space of possible shells, and then I situate the actual distribution of cells within that shape. And this is really fun because it lets me ask questions like, why is this space occupied? Why is this space not occupied? The point I want to make here is that when you're doing comparative thinking, what you're doing is this kind of situating within an evolutionary profile. And there is no one profile to pick. There are multiple different options depending on what your investigative purposes are. And so if you're putting forward a kind of story about, hey, here is how we should conceive of the shape of intelligence, you're going to make decisions about what's grounding your profile. Will it be phylogenetics? Will it be just a sort of theoretical morphospace? Will it be a narrative, as we see in the major transitions kind of frameworks? And I think it's going to really turn on, like, the way that you defend these is based on, I guess, the fruit, the way that it integrates the various bits of evidence and knowledge you're trying to make sense of, and the way that it helps you then ask further questions. And so I've sort of suggested that experimental design, how we treat results, and so forth, turns critically on the kind of evolutionary profile that we're using. And I've suggested that when people talk about the shape of life, and thus things like the shape of intelligence, we should understand this as a form of evolutionary profile. And so what a good evolutionary profile does is it gives us a sweet spot for integrating biological data. And if you're going to defend those accounts, you've got to show that they provide such a sweet spot, perhaps comparative to other ones. I've suggested that there's no single best shape of intelligence, right? It depends on what we're fundamentally interested in. When God created the universe, she didn't say, this is what intelligence is, and this is how you should conceive of it, right? If we're using comparative thinking, this is a fundamentally pluralistic and integrative kind of practice. It turns on the questions we're asking and the kind of evidence we have. Something which I think is kind of interesting here is, of course, when lots of people talk about the shape of intelligence, they're not just thinking about biology. As we saw in David's talk, we're also interested in AI, we're interested in artificial intelligences, we're interested in maybe other possible intelligences that aren't bound by evolution or biology. And something that I find interesting to think about is how it is we're supposed to integrate these, simply because a lot of the time, once you're moving outside of those evolutionary frameworks, you lose a lot of the power that comparative thinking affords you. So sorry about the technical muck up at the start, and sorry about going so fast. I hope that at least made some sense. Thanks, y'all.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Adrian.